everyone, welcome to Pen to Paper. I'm Leah Lindeman, author of the Canadian Reminiscence series, and today I'm really excited to share some really inspirational stories with you, specifically about the Halifax Explosion. And I'm going to be doing some readings from my book that I based on this very important historical event to Canada. And so I'm going to be doing that for you today. But before we get into the reading and before I give you, some stories and just what this event is about, I want to share 3 very special videos with you that have already come out or are coming up. So the first one is I sang a Christmas carol on The World According to Jay's channel, which is manned by my friend Jay. I will leave the link down below, but not only have I sung a Christmas carol on there, but also Sonora Taylor and Laurel Hightower, who are horror authors, indie horror authors. So go take a look and listen to some nice Christmas carols 'tis the season. Also, Jay, again, same Jay, is putting out a video on December 18th. There will be a premiere, and I have given some input into this video. He's asked several different book reviewers to give, I guess, the book that they felt needed the most, that could use more exposure, that they really enjoyed. And so I have a short little video in there, and several different others do. So if you want, good recommendations, then go ahead and check out that video. I'll be watching on December 18th, and I hope you'll join me too. I will also leave a link down below. And then the last one, since it's Christmas, Codex Cantina, they're great book reviewers, discussers. They discuss literary classics, but right now for Christmas, they are looking into a German Christmas. What makes a German Christmas? All the traditions and everything about it. So I will also leave a link down below to their channel, and you can check out those videos. Very interesting. So now let's get to today's moment. The Halifax Explosion of 1917 happened 104 years ago. And it's a piece of history that needs to be remembered because it was happening during World War I. But this man-made explosion disaster was happened on the home front. And these people who were not expecting such a devastation to occur on a regular day in the morning at 9:04 a.m. suffered heavy, heavy losses. And I think that's something that we all can relate to today. The last 2 years have been really tough. And for us, yes, it has been a much more prolonged period. But in the moment of devastation and suffering, there are so many stories of courage and bravery and hope that there's a better tomorrow. So I want to share some of these with you, but also to kind of share the gravity of what happened. And I'm not going to inundate you with too many historical facts. There's so much that could be said, but I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. So just to kind of give you a picture of what happened. December 5th, we had 2 ships in the harbor in Nova Scotia. One was the SS Emo, and that was a relief supply ship from Belgium. And then we have the Mont Blanc, which was a ship laden with heavy explosives, so about 2.9 kilotons of TNT. The Emo was supposed to have left the harbor on December 5th, but it was waiting for more coal to be put onto the ship so it could actually go, and the coal shipment was late, so it actually got stuck in the harbor. The morning of the explosion, the Emo relief ship was on the wrong side of the harbor, and after many blasting signals and trying to figure out what side they were going to be on, they shut off the engines, but the momentum carried them toward each other, and they collided. And so because of that, the Mont Blanc's barrels of TNT and explosives fell over, flooded the whole deck. Now, when the engine shut off some sparks ignited the TNT, and so therefore it caught on fire. And people are just walking around in their day-to-day lives on the streets, and they start gathering toward the harbor because they see this huge fire. Well, that fire turned into the biggest man-made explosion to date of that time. 2,000 people were killed instantly, and 9,000 people suffered injuries. About 1.6 mile radius from the center of the blast, all the buildings were completely leveled and obliterated. There was a sugar refinery, factories all along the harbor, completely destroyed. And this is where the setting of my story begins. And I had this idea in my head of putting this story together of a woman going through this and losing her husband in this explosion, because not only were people dead and not only were they injured, but many of them went missing. And it was difficult to find all the bodies. You couldn't find all the bodies because many of them, there was no trace, but perhaps the personal effects that belonged to them. And so it is about one woman's story of persevering and trying to find her husband, but at the same time going through this and coming out on the other end a new person. What does that renewal of life look like in someone's life after such a devastation? So I'm going to read to you from a few pages of my book that hopefully help paint a picture of what it would have been like to have been in the explosion and how devastating it was to the people of Halifax. So she has just been doing housework. It's the morning. Her husband's gone to work. And this is what she sees and how she reacts to it. She backed up into a chair, turned it around, and slowly sat upon it. From what she could tell, 2 of the ships had collided. One of the ships sported a large gash at its forehold. Many people, including children, had started to gather in the streets and near the docks to watch the spectacle. Flames burst from the ship's hold and licked the sides of steel. All she could do was stare at the roiling smoke. She had seen smoke like this, her dream. Her nerves began to tingle, her fingertips shook. She swallowed her growing terror, rose from her chair, and stared into the middle of the swirling pillar of smoke. The smoke furling in continuous circles hypnotized her. She could not fathom what had caused this strange beauty manifesting its fearsome strength. Was it a munition ship? Tommy had said something like this might happen. Suddenly, the smoke vanished, and a brighter light than the sun flooded her entire vision. Awestruck, Evelyn covered her squinting eyes with her hands and could not breathe. Oh, dear God, what is this? She knew not what to think. As quickly as she could, she crawled underneath the oak table. She was hidden on all sides with a draping tablecloth. She hugged her knees to her chest. Soon the ground began to shake beneath her. Would the earth swallow her deep into its pit? And Carl, she hoped he would be all right. An ear-shuddering strum grew louder and louder until she squeezed her eyes closed. Death was near. Dark gray light spattered and black blotches pervaded her sight. Different sounds meshed into one jumbled flow. She licked her lips to taste a bitter metal substance. She tried to spit it out immediately, but failed in doing so. She felt a soothing touch sweep over her brow. A sweet, low voice spoke to her. Evelyn raised her hand to see what was covering her mouth. Ah! Excruciating pain shot into her right arm. Shh, it's all right, dear. Everything will be okay. The bright light Evelyn had seen was gone. The world was now black with death. The sun had been defeated. Everywhere ash rained down from heaven upon ruins and rubble. Her house and others had either warped, broken in pieces, or fallen to the ground. Trees and telegraph posts had snapped in two. Where am I? What happened? Where's my husband? Here, let me tend to your arm. Who are you? I am Nurse "Nurse Randall, come here immediately. I need your help," a man's voice called from within the bleak wilderness. "I'm coming, doctor." The nurse turned to Evelyn and said, "I'll be right back, dear. Stay here. Don't move around. And keep this blanket on your arm." Then she left as a ghost slips through the shadows. What had happened? Had the Germans attacked? I need answers. I need to find Carl. She tried to summon her strength. Attempting to rise, she fell to the ground on her back. Again she tried and then succeeded. Slowly she removed the blanket on her arm to see the damage. Her arm was burned close to the bone, charred and white in some areas. The edges of her burn were welting her tender flesh. She covered her arm with the blanket again because of the extreme pain searing her. Her head twisted from left to right. As far as her eye could see, houses had turned into ash-covered ruins. People were dead. People cried in pain. Fire licked its victims. Her dreams, her reveries were manifesting themselves. What on earth had happened? Carl. He was supposed to be at work, but the whole of Halifax had not escaped the wrath of fate. Had he survived? Had he... There was only one thing to do. She would find him, no matter what the cost. Determination had settled within every fiber of Evelyn's will, although her frail metal insistently persuaded her to lie down and drift into a state of unconscious debilitation. She took a few small steps forward and wandered into the rolling smoke about her. Her eyes burned from the fumes intoxicating the area. She looked down to see the skirt ripped to shreds and her top outerwear missing. She placed her unscathed arm over her thinly covered chest for modesty's sake. Soldiers, servicemen, and medical personnel entered the area in a trickle, aiding those who were trapped within the rubble of unrecognizable homes. They helped drive the greatly injured to the nearest hospitals in whatever civilian or army automobiles they could find. All the streets looked the same. Evelyn tried to find her bearings, but could not distinguish anything. "Dear me, what are you doing up and about?" Nurse Randall's face came into view. I need to find my husband." "I'm sorry, dear, you can't in this condition. How are you going to help him when you need help yourself?" Evelyn's head drooped. She felt a deep pressure throbbing in her forehead. She lifted her grimy hand to the side of her temple, feeling splotches of dry and wet blood. "You've been cut in some areas by shards of glass. Come now. I'm sending you to the hospital. Don't you go running off right now. We're going to get you some help." She bustled off. Evelyn, weak and hurting, could not stand any longer. She lowered herself to the ground. Nurse Randall came back in several minutes with 2 men and a stretcher. "There's space for you on an automobile. They'll take you to Camp Hill Hospital." The men lowered the stretcher onto the ground and offered her their hands. Weakly, she settled her body into the tarp, a bloodied canvas worn from being painted upon. The 2 men grunted as they picked her up and started walking. God knew where. The rhythm of their shuffling feet and the strokes of their encumbered breathing guided her mind into oblivion, and even in her rest, peace was not to be found. She woke up a minute later, not being able to sleep properly because of the automobile's stop-go rhythm. She lifted her head an inch to see the destruction had uniformly blanketed the entire area. She wondered how widespread the damage really was. People were everywhere, walking around in confusion. Some were sifting through the corpses that had been laid on the side of the road to see if they could find their deceased loved ones. She could not tell one person from the next, for all their faces were covered in oily soot. My face looks the same as well. Suddenly she felt a crinkling of paper beneath her aching fingers. I still have it. She pried open the petite slit in her dress, which was the opening to a secret pocket within which she always kept a photograph of Carl on their wedding day. Gingerly she placed it upon her bosom. The whole grimy scene faded once again into nothing. So that's just a little taste of what it would have been like to be right there when it happened. But even in devastation, the human spirit has such an amazing capacity to rally. And by noon that same day, the Halifax Relief Commission was formed. And as I said in my writing, people were moving victims right away to the hospital using whatever means they could. Not only did they have to look for people who were thrown off by the blast, but also people who were trapped in their homes because the homes collapsed and a lot of the wood stoves tipped over and fires started everywhere in homes and people were trapped and people were dying. And yet, through it all, there was so much done. I said that 9,000 people were injured. A lot of those had to do with people being blinded by the shards of glass literally flying into their eyes. And I read of many accounts where doctors stood for 60 hours without a break because not only did they have to, kind of buck up and work with what they had, but there was no one there to come in and help. The trains had all stopped a safe distance, and that one of the great heroes of that disaster was Patrick Vincent Coleman. He was a worker at the railway. He and his co-worker were leaving, but then he remembered that there was a train coming in from New Brunswick with 300 passengers, and he went back to his post and he sent them a message saying to stop. And they stopped at Rockingham, which was a safe distance away. They didn't feel the blast, or they felt the blast, but they were safe. And he died at his post because he went back to save 300 people. But he could have left. He could have shirked his duty. He could have just saved his own skin, but he didn't. He died for those people. And as I said, because all the trains were stopped, and not only did they have to deal with the explosion and people dying in a fire, but there was a blizzard that very same day and night. And they had to find people under their homes that were being frozen. It was a crazy situation. And so, of course, there were so many victims. The doctors were standing around for 60 hours until replacements could be found. Because the railways were stopped, it took time for replacements to be sent from Montreal, Quebec, New Brunswick, and even Boston. Boston sent in great aid to Halifax during all this. Now, not only was the city of Halifax destroyed, but there was also a Mi'kmaq indigenous settlement in the coves across the harbor. And because of the blast, there was a tsunami wave. The Mi'kmaq settlement was completely destroyed, gone. And then there was also another settlement, Africville, specifically for the Black community. And many of their homes were destroyed when already their community was substandard living. And they did not get as much help as they needed from this. So there is so much suffering and loss in this event. But people like Patrick Vincent Coleman and those frontline workers like the nurses and doctors that stood for 60 hours to care for patients, those are the heroes. And we have people like that today. I know it seems like a hopeless situation, and yes, things are getting better, and that's great. But let's not forget those who were away from home from their families just to cope with, specifically, and even still, with this pandemic. And not only people who succumb to the virus, but just all the rest of the terrible things that have happened because of this. So, frontline workers, thank you very much. They were a part of this story, and you are a part of our story right now. And then I'm going to read one more reading. The explosion has happened, and it took a long time for them to bring the bodies together. They actually used a school as a morgue, and then for them to embalm the bodies and lay them to rest. So I'm going to read this next passage that has to do with, the practicalities of trying to find a loved one that was missing from this explosion. So Evelyn has just gone all over the place, all the hospitals, even the hospital ship that was in the harbor that was there the day of the explosion, and she cannot find her husband at all. And so she decides the last stop that she dreads going to is the morgue, and here she is. She dreaded visiting the morgue, prolonging the need to see a gravestone marked with his description, but it had to be done. The school, with its clinging stench of death and misery, came into her carriage window's view. The carriage wobbled a little as the horses slowed to a sloppy stop, the movement making her sick to the stomach. Before opening the carriage door, she endeavored to take in large breaths of air so that she would not faint while she stood to exit. The clacking of the departing horse's hooves and wheels made her want to run back to it, to beg the driver to let her back in. Would she be able to handle the possibility of seeing not only her husband's grave, but also the hundreds of others? The creaking of the entrance door sent a small shiver down her arms. She walked a few steps and stopped. Another woman was walking down the hallway toward her. "Good evening, can I help you?" the woman asked in a firm tone. "Perhaps you can. I know you probably don't have the unidentified bodies still in the morgue." "No, we don't. The bodies were buried on December 17th last year. The burial of the dead continued on until Christmas Eve." "Last year." Yes, it's hard to believe how much time has passed. Professor R.N. Stone and another by the name of A. Schrister embalmed the bodies to preserve them as long as possible. After a time, they needed to be buried. "Of course. Where may I find the graves?" "Well, the dead have been buried in several cemeteries. It would take a long time for you to visit all of them." "If that is what I must do, then I will." "There is an easier way to find your loved one. A chart of the graves was made. On it has a number assigned to the deceased and any description of what they looked like, their personal effects, and such things." "Where is this list?" "We have a copy of it here. Let me retrieve it." "Thank you." The woman returned 5 minutes later with a few papers in her hand. She pointed to a desk at which they could both sit. "Here are the markers. Take all the time you need." Evelyn handled the papers, reading each description. Many only had one or two pieces of information, such as the unidentified person having had 3 children and a pocket watch. Another woman had a whole paragraph dedicated to what she was wearing, her personal effects, and so on. And still, no one claimed her. How can that be? There were some descriptions of men which were similar to what Carl's description might be if he were really dead, but she couldn't say with certainty that any one of them was he. He might not have been brought to the morgue. What if his body is a pile of burnt ashes carried away by the wind? Or he wandered so far into some woods and is now rotting away without a proper burial place? Nothing is certain. "Thank you so much for your time." Evelyn recruited all the papers into a neat pile and put them into the hands of the woman. "I must go now. You've been very helpful." And so this was the reality for so many, that they couldn't know for certain whether their loved one died because there just wasn't enough information on the body. And the rest of the story just goes on with how she learns to cope with this truth and new beginnings, and what that looks like for her, or what it could look like for someone who has been in that situation. So thank you for letting me share this story with you. Not just my particular story. This is just, a fictional story, but the real story of what took place. And I hope that, actually, what's really interesting is because Boston was immediately sent relief aid to Halifax. Halifax sends a Christmas tree to Boston every year. They did it in 1918 and then it stopped. And then they resumed the gift back in 1971. And Halifax, or I should say the Nova Scotian government, has sent a tree every year since then. And it is the tree, Boston's official tree, that is lighted on Boston Common every year. That is one symbol of remembering those whose lives were lost, and for just appreciating those who willingly sacrifice their time and their energy to care for those in need. Thank you again. I hope that you've enjoyed this little piece of history. May you have an amazing week.